Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling the history of Yahweh.
All right.
You sent us a YouTube video called The History of Yahweh Storm God to Israelite Deity. And, we thought it'd be interesting to dive into this and kind of see how this God Yahweh went from, a seemingly obscure deity to this singular God we know today.
Yeah, it really is amazing when you think about it, how this, kind of almost minor deity in the beginning becomes this incredibly powerful God that we see today. And the evolution of that, the changes that happen over time are just fascinating.
Yeah, and the video even points out right at the beginning, we don't even know how to pronounce Yahweh.
Right.
The last people who knew how to properly pronounce his name lived over 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, it is remarkable, isn't it? Scholars use Yahweh based on what we can piece together from, Hebrew vowel points and constructions and things like that. But, there's even earlier forms of the name. We know that Yahu pops up in some Egyptian inscriptions.
Yahoo!
Yeah, dating back to about the 14th century BC.
So is that kind of the first time we see Yahweh pop up in history in these Egyptian inscriptions?
It's one of the earliest mentions that we have.
Yeah.
And in fact, the same Egyptian inscriptions even talk about the Shasu of Yahweh.
The what of Yahweh?
The Shasu, S-H-A-S-U.
Yeah.
And these were, possibly nomadic raiders who some scholars believe were ancestors of the Israelites.
Oh, wow.
So it's a really early glimpse into the world that Yahweh inhabited.
So we have Yahweh or Yahu appearing in Egypt about 3,400 years ago. What do we know about what people believed about him back then?
Well, to get to that, we have to look at some of the oldest texts that we have in the Hebrew Bible. And these texts are, it's kind of like if you're trying to understand modern English and you're looking at Chaucer, they seem very different and archaic and strange. But they give us a window into what people believed back then. And what these texts reveal is that early Yahweh was very much a force of nature, a storm god associated with those powerful thunderstorms in the southern Levant and the area of southern Jordan in particular.
So he's a storm god?
Yeah, storm god.
In the desert.
In the desert.
Right.
Imagine those torrential downpours, the deafening thunder. It would have been a sight to behold and very much a deity to be reckoned with.
Yeah. And the video also mentioned Yahweh as a war god.
That's right. We see this in some of the oldest texts within the Hebrew Bible. They contain these war hymns and these war songs that are attributed to Yahweh, and some of them are even attributed to female warband prophets like Deborah and Miriam.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And they paint this really vivid picture of Yahweh, not as some kind of god of grand armies, but as a god of, battles and skirmishes and raiding parties.
Right.
Much more like desert Vikings than anything else.
Desert Vikings.
Yeah.
So it seems like this image of Yahweh is very different from the more universal, all-powerful God that we're familiar with now.
He was much more localized and a bit rough around the edges, I would say, compared to this later concept of this universal, all-powerful God.
Yeah.
And it really speaks to the incredible transformation that he went through over the course of centuries.
Yeah, so then as he started to enter the Canaanite pantheon, it seems like things start to get a little bit more complex, right?
Oh, yeah.
You have this kind of clash of the titans, so to speak, with Yahweh versus Baal.
Yeah, and this clash between Yahweh and Baal, who's this storm god who's already present in the Canaanite pantheon, it was a big deal. It was about more than just, divine ego or anything like that.
Yeah.
For the average person, reign meant survival. And many people probably saw Yahweh and Baal as, essentially the same God, just with different names.
Right.
So it didn't really matter if you called him Yahweh or if you called him Baal. He was bringing the rain. He was ensuring the crops were going to grow.
Yeah.
And you were going to survive. But for those who were pushing for a distinct Yahweh worship, this blending, this mixing, it was a problem.
Right. So it's almost like a battle of the brands.
Exactly.
With Yahweh and Baal.
Exactly.
So Yahweh, he's mixing and matching with the Canaanite gods.
We see him absorbing characteristics from both El, this wise grandfatherly figure, and Baal, the powerful storm god. And it's a real testament to how fluid these ancient belief systems were. These deities weren't static. They evolved and they changed, reflecting the needs and the understanding of the people who followed them.
Right. So as Yahweh was evolving and getting more complex, did this play out differently across the land?
It did. Yahweh worship started to take different paths in the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. So in the north, they took a much more inclusive approach, blending Yahweh worship with the existing Canaanite practices. They were even comfortable with visual representations of Yahweh, including bull imagery.
Bull imagery in the north?
Yeah.
What about in the south?
Down in Judah, things were much different. Especially under King Josiah, there was this real push for an exclusive and a centralized Yahweh worship focused on the Jerusalem temple, and there was absolutely no bull imagery allowed. Josiah went so far as to crack down on other shrines that didn't really align with this vision of this kind of pure Yahweh faith that he was trying to promote.
So we have these two different Yahwehs emerging, right? One in the north and one in the south.
Yeah.
But then the story doesn't end there.
No, it doesn't.
Because I know that there are some pretty major historical events that kind of shake things up and force the followers of Yahweh to kind of rethink who Yahweh is and what his role is.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. These cataclysmic events that happened really forced them to rethink Yahweh and their relationship with him.
Okay. And we'll get to that in just a minute.
All right. One second.
So we were talking about these major historical events that kind of shook things up.
Yeah.
With Yahweh worship.
Right.
What happened?
Well, imagine the upheaval when the Assyrians came in and wiped out the northern kingdom in 722 BC.
Oh, wow.
It was a devastating event. A flood of refugees poured into the south, into Judah, bringing with them their own unique understanding of Yahweh and his worship.
So that must have been like a huge challenge for someone like Josiah, who was trying to promote this one pure version of Yahweh worship.
Absolutely. It would have thrown a real wrench into Josiah's plans. You could just imagine the theological debates and the arguments that must have taken place as people tried to make sense of it all.
Yeah, because if Yahweh was supposed to be this all-powerful God who'd chosen them specifically, how could he allow this to happen?
Right. It really challenged the whole idea of Yahweh's power and his relationship with his people.
So the destruction of the northern kingdom was a major turning point.
It was.
But if I remember correctly, then the Babylonians come along and things get even worse.
Oh yeah, much worse. In 586 BC, the Babylonians swept through Judah. They destroyed Jerusalem. They destroyed the first temple, which was, the heart of Yahweh worship for the people in the south.
So this wasn't just a military defeat. This was like a full-blown theological crisis.
It was a crisis of faith. If Yahweh was tied to a specific location, a specific temple, what happened when that location was destroyed? Where did Yahweh go?
That's a really good question. So how did the people deal with this? Did they just give up on Yahweh?
Some probably did. But for others, this crisis forced them to rethink the very nature of their God. They were ripped from their homeland. Their temple lay in ruins. And in this context, the idea of a God tied to a single location just didn't make sense anymore.
So they had to come up with a new understanding of Yahweh.
They did. And it was during this time, this period of exile in Babylon, that we see the seeds of monotheism being sown. Yahweh had to become something bigger, something more universal, a God who was present everywhere, even in exile.
So in a way, this devastating loss, this destruction of the temple, actually paved the way for a more expansive understanding of God.
In a way, it did. It's really quite remarkable how something so tragic could lead to such a profound theological shift.
Yeah, it's almost like Yahweh had to evolve in order to survive. Exactly.
So we've gone from this desert storm god to this more universal God.
Right.
But the story doesn't end there, does it?
No, it doesn't. And to understand what happens next, we need to talk about something called Jewish binitarianism.
Jewish what?
Binitarianism. It was an idea that was circulating at the time that proposed there were two aspects of the divine. There was this God beyond knowing, a God who was too vast and too complex for humans to fully grasp. And then there was a more accessible, lesser Yahweh, who often took the form of the angel Metatron.
So two levels of God.
Essentially, yes. A distant, unknowable God, and a more relatable intermediary figure.
So how does Jesus fit into all of this?
Well, that's where Paul's mystical experiences come in. It was through his visions of the resurrected Jesus that he seemingly connected this binitarian concept to this new Jesus movement. In essence, he placed Jesus in the role of this lesser Yahweh, this accessible face of the divine.
So it's like all these different pieces of a theological puzzle are coming together.
You have this idea of a God beyond knowing, and then you have this more accessible intermediary figure.
Right.
And then you have Paul's visions of Jesus.
Exactly.
And it all comes together to create this new understanding of God and the relationship between the divine and humanity.
It really is fascinating how it all comes together.
Now, I remember the video also mentioned something about a demiurge.
Ah, yes, the demiurge. That's a fascinating concept.
What is that all about?
Well, think of it this way. Imagine the true God, this God beyond knowing, wants to create the material world. But he's too perfect, too pure to work with this messy physical stuff. So he hires a subcontractor to handle the construction, and the subcontractor is the demiurge.
Okay, so the demiurge is like this cosmic contractor.
Exactly. He's building the physical universe according to the true God's blueprint.
But like any contractor, maybe he cut a few corners, messed up a few details.
You got it. And that's where it gets really interesting. Some early Christians, particularly those we now call Gnostics, took this idea of a flawed demiurge and they ran with it. They looked at all the suffering and the imperfection of the world and they thought, there's no way the God of love revealed in Jesus could have created this mess.
It must have been that shoddy demiurge.
Exactly. They saw the demiurge as responsible for all the bad stuff in the world.
So the demiurge becomes like this scapegoat.
Right. Don't blame the true God, blame the demiurge.
It was his fault for messing up creation.
Precisely. And to support their view, they pointed to the Old Testament with all its stories of divine wrath and punishment. This reinforced their idea of a flawed creator God separate from the loving God revealed in Jesus.
That's really interesting. So we have this Gnostic interpretation with the demiurge.
Right.
And then we have the more traditional view of a single God with Jesus as the Son.
Right.
Which becomes the foundation of what we call Orthodox Christianity.
Exactly.
But wasn't the demiurge concept pretty popular back then?
It was more widespread than many people realize. In fact, Valentinus, a well-known Gnostic thinker, almost became the Bishop of Rome.
Really?
Yeah, it's a detail that's often overlooked. It challenges this traditional narrative of a unified early Christian movement. The reality is there were many different Christianities vying for dominance.
So why did the Gnostic interpretation with the demiurge fade away while the idea of a single God with Jesus as the Son became the dominant view? Was it just a better idea?
It's not that simple. While theological arguments certainly played a role, it was more about how these different Christianities interacted with the world around them. They weren't just arguing about ideas, they were building communities, they were forming alliances, they were vying for influence. And the version that ultimately triumphed wasn't necessarily theologically superior, it was the one that best adapted to the political realities of the Roman Empire.
So it was this combination of theological debate, social dynamics, and political maneuvering.
Exactly. It was a complex and messy process.
That led to the rise of what we now call Orthodox Christianity.
Right.
But even within that tradition, it seems like this tension between the Old Testament God and the New Testament God never really went away.
It didn't. Even today, you hear people talking about the God of the Old Testament as this harsh, judgmental figure, while the God of the New Testament is all about love and forgiveness. It's like the shadow of the demiurge is still lingering, even if the name itself has been largely forgotten.
So it's not just about what people believed, it's about how they lived out those beliefs, how they organized themselves, how they navigated the political landscape.
Precisely. It's a reminder that religious ideas don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by, and in turn, shape the social and political and cultural contexts in which they emerge.
It makes you wonder, what if things had gone differently?
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, what if Paul hadn't had those visions right? Or what if a different version of Christianity had taken root, like the Gnostics with their demiurge? It really makes you think about how history could have been so different.
It does, doesn't it? You know, the Christianity we know today wasn't inevitable. It came about because of a very specific set of circumstances, this mix of theological debates and social movements and political realities. It's a reminder that, you know, history is full of these unexpected turns and that the past is always more complex than we think.
So we started this deep dive with Yahweh as like a desert storm god, and now we're talking about the rise of Christianity and mystical experiences and this idea of a demiurge. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And, you know, I think one of the most important things to take away from all of this is that religious ideas, they're always evolving. You know, they adapt to new environments, they absorb new influences, they're reshaped by the people who carry them. It's kind of like watching a species evolve, but instead of physical traits, it's ideas that are changing and adapting over time.
Yeah, so looking back at Yahweh's journey from storm god to the singular God of, you know, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, what does this tell us about the nature of belief itself?
It tells us that belief is fluid, it's dynamic, and it's deeply intertwined with the human experience. It's not static, it's not fixed. It's constantly responding to new circumstances and new reinterpretations. You know, the ancient Israelites facing exile in Babylon needed a different kind of God than their ancestors who were struggling for survival in the deserts of Canaan.
That makes sense. Their understanding of God had to evolve to meet their changing needs and circumstances.
Exactly.
And isn't that true for all of us, really? I mean, our beliefs, even our beliefs about something as fundamental as God, are shaped by our experiences, our culture, the world around us.
Absolutely. And acknowledging this fluidity, this constant evolution of belief, it doesn't diminish its importance or its power.
Yeah.
If anything, it makes it even more fascinating and relevant to our lives.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes to how dynamic and how complex the history of religion is. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the evolution of ideas, the power of belief, and the impact that all of this has had on human history.
And I think it also encourages us to question our assumptions. We tend to think of religious beliefs as fixed and unchanging. But history shows us that that's rarely the case. Beliefs evolve, they blend, they sometimes clash, and through it all, they reflect the hopes and the fears and the struggles of the people who hold them.
It feels like we've only just scratched the surface here.
We have. There's always more to learn, more to discover.
I feel like I could spend years exploring the history of Yahweh and the rise of Christianity.
And that's what makes it so captivating. It's an invitation to keep questioning, keep researching, keep expanding our understanding of this vast tapestry of human belief.
So to wrap things up, what's the one key insight you hope listeners will take away from this deep dive?
I would say approach the history of religion and really any historical narrative with a sense of curiosity and openness. Be willing to question your assumptions, to consider multiple perspectives, and to embrace the messiness and the complexity of the past, because it's in that messiness, in those unexpected twists and turns, that we often find the most profound insights.
That's a great point. It's a reminder that history is not just a collection of facts and figures. It's a living, breathing story that continues to shape our world today. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the endless wonders of history and the human experience.